Hello, welcome to a new edition of the Right Wing Populist Podcast. I am the Right Wing Populist. So sorry for not having a weekly wrap this past weekend. Had a little bit of a interesting weekend, so my mind was on other things, but we're back to the regularly scheduled program, folks. We'll go back to Monday to Thursday, and then Saturday we'll have the weekly wrap. So my apologies. Thanksgiving weekend, things get busy. So, my apologies, but we should be back on schedule going forward. So today I want to talk about what neoconservatism is. And the reason I want to talk about it is you've had people who used to be part of the Republican establishment, people like Mark Levin, Douglas Murray, Ben Shapiro, these people who are what I would describe neocons, who used to openly talk about what neoconservative it is and talk about it like it was a positive. But now, if you describe them as neoconservatives, they get really defensive. They'll say, oh, that's the N-word. That's what, if you guys watched Douglas Murray's debate with Dave Smith, he said, oh, the N-word, a play on the actual N-word, implying, oh, it's such a taboo word to say, neoconservatism. And then, you have people like Mark Levin who say it's like basically calling someone a Jew if you're a neocon. So I want to get into what neoconservatism is and why it became such a toxic word. And why people who are neocons, fundamentally, why they try to distance themselves from the word. But before we get into all of that, I want you to subscribe, whether it's on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever the hell you listen to this amazing audio experience. I would really appreciate it. So, you could say the origins of neoconservatism really started in the George H.W. Bush administration. You had people like Donald Rumsfeld, others who sort of developed this idea of nation building. And the concept was we can bring democracy to other countries by using force. Not just through persuasion or aid, let's say, but we could topple dictatorships in other countries, particularly the Middle East. No coincidence, that's where the oil is. No coincidence at all. Also the benefit of Israel, no coincidence. But particularly in the Middle East, the concept was, if we topple these dictator governments, it'll spring democracy everywhere, and everything will be hunky-dory, sunshine and rainbows, dogs and cats, living in harmony. Everything was going to be great. No more gay people. Maybe not that part, but everything was going to be hunky-dory. That was sort of the concept, speaking in general terms. But this concept really got pushed in the George W. Bush administration, the second Bush, the stupider son of George H.W. Bush, George W. Bush. And when 9/11 happened, they sort of used this as a pretext to really dive into neoconservative ideology. And in fact, as Dave Smith has talked about, there was this memo that Wesley Clark, a four-star general, talked about how the neocons in the Bush administration planned to invade all these different countries and topple these countries. It ended up happening. Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria now. Many of these countries that were supposedly on this list have been, we did regime change wars there. So 9/11 happens. The Bush administration uses it as a pretext to invade Iraq. We invade Afghanistan. Now, in all fairness, the original Afghanistan war, you could argue, really wasn't a neocon war at the beginning because it was more or less defensive in nature. You could understand why. But it became a neocon war, and we never left until, Joe Biden took us out. Trump started the process. Biden finished the process. He did it incompetently. But these wars were extremely, and we also, and one last thing, the wars were very unpopular. That's very important to note. At first, because of 9/11, there was all this rally to the flag. The Bush administration was saying that, Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. That's why they invaded Iraq. There were these claims. So the wars were very popular at the beginning. However, very quickly they became unpopular. And it almost cost George W. Bush's re-election. He barely won that election. If Ohio had voted for Kerry, Bush would have lost. One state votes 200,000 votes a different way, or less than that, carries the president. And remember, George W. Bush had super high approval ratings right after 9/11. The 2002 midterms, Republicans way outperformed what usually happens when a party is the one in power. They gained seats. That never happens to the party that's holding the White House in an off-year election, a midterm election, but it did. And that was because of all, George W. Bush did a good job. I'm not saying he shouldn't have done this. This is what he should have done after the tragedy of 9/11. But he did a really good job of bringing the country together at the beginning. And because he was a Republican, the Republican Party did benefit from it. That's not malicious or anything. That's just a statement of fact. But the wars became very unpopular quickly because Americans don't like war, especially when it's not clear to them that the wars were justified. And as it became more clear, particularly with Iraq, that there were no weapons of mass destruction, the country turned on George W. Bush, the two wars, very quickly. Not only that, you bring that also with the fact that by the end of Bush's term, the economy was collapsing. You had the Great Recession. And that really didn't have much to do with the wars per se, and more to do with the housing market, obviously. But to your average day, citizen, American voter, they sort of felt like you're more focused on war than you are on the economy, and that's why the economy is now collapsing at the end of Bush's term. It's sort of a warning sign for the current Trump administration. I'm not going to get into that with too much detail, but that's sort of their problem they're facing. A lot of people think that the Trump administration is more focused on the rest of the world instead of the United States. But I digress. That was certainly the case for the Bush administration at the end. There's no question about that. And George W. Bush left office with one of the lowest approval ratings ever for a president leaving office. It was like around 20%, according to many surveys at the time. And it's why Barack Hussein Obama was able to win the 2008 election in a massive, for today's terms, what you'd call a massive landslide. He won by about 8 points in the national vote. He swept all the competitive states and won red states in the Electoral College. Indiana was a red state that he won. It was not a close election because of how unpopular George W. Bush and therefore the Neocons became. Very unpopular. I need to emphasize this. Americans fully rejected neoconservatism in the 2008 election. They made it very clear they did not support it. Now, you can think the American public is wrong. Okay, fine. But they're the voters. The American people are the voters. They get to dictate the direction of the country, not bureaucrats in Washington, not war whores in Washington and working all these ridiculous think tanks, people like Bill Kristol, etc. The American people dictate the direction of the country. And they made it very clear that they wanted to move away from neoconservatism. So they elected what they thought, and Obama was a more or less progressive liberal. But that's not exactly what we got with Obama. Contrary to what you'd hear on Fox News for 8 years during his presidency, Obama was not that much different than George W. Bush when it came to certainly foreign policy. Remember, it was under Obama when the Americans overthrew Gaddafi in Libya. That was a neocon war. That was a neocon thing to do. Just because it was a Democrat doesn't mean it's not neoconservatism. That was us toppling a government that had done everything he could to satisfy the United States, because Gaddafi, when he saw how crazy George W. Bush was when he was invading all these other countries, Iraq, Afghanistan, etc., Gaddafi was like, oh shit, this cowboy's crazy. I'm going to try to get on his good side so he doesn't do the same thing to me. So Gaddafi gave up his weapons. He made it clear to the Bush administration, hey man, I'm going to do whatever the hell you want. Just leave me alone. And, to George W. Bush's credit, he kept his word. But when Obama got into office, that changed. Hillary Clinton, that crazy bitch, decided that we needed to get rid of Gaddafi. For whatever reason. You could think of, maybe oil, maybe other things, who knows? I'm not going to get into all of the rationales. It'll take too long. But Hillary Clinton was like, yeah, Gaddafi, you're gone. And Obama went along with it. Again, remember, this is important. Obama, there was about 3 or 4 wars going on when he got into office the first time. When he left office, we were like in 7. Obama actually increased the amount of wars we were in during his presidency at the end of it than it was when he began it. Again, this guy ran on not being George W. Bush. He ran on being a peace president, not a neocon. But once he got into office, that's what he did. He became a neocon. He started bombing Syria, Yemen. These were wars that neocon wars. And, the other aspect I have to talk about regarding neoconservatism is Israel. I know people are like, you can't talk about that. It's anti-Semitic, Wolfowitz, all these, Douglas Murray's bullshit. Look, the reality is there is a strong correlation between people who care about Israel and people who are neocons. You may not like that, but that's just the fact. Okay, that's just a fact. And it actually makes sense if you think about it. It benefits Israel to have a strong military force backing them, and that'll topple their enemies, because neoconservatism, they've gone after a bunch of countries in the Middle East that are opposed to Israel. Now, you can argue whether or not the real intent for the United States is to actually benefit Israel versus just trying to get these other countries' natural resources like oil. That's a fair debate, but it actually, whatever the rationale is, at least at the time, because Israel was a very popular country in the United States, particularly during the Bush years, it became sort of like, not only are we doing this because it's good for the world, good for the United States, but it's also good for our top ally, Israel. It became a good rationale at the time. Today, it's not. People are sick of Israel. They think Israel got way out of control over the last 3 years, what they were doing in Gaza. Whatever you can agree or disagree with it, but there's no question public support totally diminished against, for Israel. There's no question about that. So there is a connection that you will see between people who are very supportive of Israel and neocons. Why do you think Ben Shapiro was a start neocon for all this? He still is, but why do you think he was a public neocon? I mean, Ben Shapiro did a whole article or big piece at the time. I think he was a young, he might have been in college in all fairness, but he's still a smart guy. He did a whole piece about saying how the war in Iraq is good for the United States. Has he ever apologized for that article? I don't think he has. He's apologized for other things he said. But has he ever apologized for supporting the Iraq war, the Afghanistan, all these ridiculous wars, Libya? He hasn't. Because he is a neocon. So, George W. Bush makes neoconservatism extremely unpopular. Obama, while a Democrat, so the accusation of neoconservatism isn't necessarily a natural fit, his foreign policy was a neocon foreign policy. Okay, it just was. Just look at it again. When he got into office, we were in 3 or 4 different interventions. When he left, we were in 7. Okay, he started wars in Yemen, Syria, some other place I'm not remembering on the top of my head. Okay, this is Obama was a neocon when it came to foreign policy. He didn't do a bunch of tax cuts like the Bush administration did economic-wise, but he was a neocon, Obama, at his heart. Maybe he wasn't when he got into office, first off, and it was just one of those things where he was basically steamrolled by the establishment. That happens. It's happened to even Trump to some degree. But whatever the reason is, he became a neocon. He governed like a neocon in office. And again, the American public was rejecting that. So here comes Trump, and this is the really important part. Trump decides to run for president in 2016. But Trump has a problem because the establishment is already, backing, Jeb Bush, George W. Bush's brother. Again, the king of the neocons, George W. Bush. His brother, Jeb Bush, is getting all the donor support. It's part of the reason Trump decides to self-fund his campaign. Not only is it smart politically, it's a good political message to say, I'm not beholden to any donors. It was also sort of by necessity because all the big donors were backing Jeb Bush and a few other establishment candidates like Marco Rubio, etc. So Trump sort of has a challenge here. It's how does he distinguish himself from the establishment? How does he run against the Republican establishment? Well, he does it by attacking Republican Party orthodoxy. And one of the main ways he does it is by attacking foreign policy, the standard Republican foreign policy, which is neoconservatism. It's not the only thing. Trade was another big thing as well, because Republican Party had always been super pro-free trade. Trump ran against free trade. He ran as a protectionist. So foreign policy wasn't the only factor. But it was arguably the biggest, and it certainly distinguished him the most from Jeb Bush, who was at the time considered the frontrunner. And you can see in these debates where Trump is making these points about how the Iraq war, Afghanistan war were huge mistakes. He literally said to Jeb Bush, George W. Bush's brother, that W. Bush lied about weapons of mass destruction. He said that in a Republican debate in South Carolina, a red state, to George W. Bush's brother, that he lied about weapons of mass destruction. And Trump fucking won. He beat the Republican establishment. Again, war wasn't the only issue. I'm not trying to be disingenuous, but it was like the biggest, arguably. It was one of the biggest. And Republican voters, they decide to reject neoconservatism in the Republican primary. So not only is the American public rejected neoconservatism, the Republican base, the hardest of hardcore Republican voters who vote in Republican primaries, they reject neoconservatism in 2016. So, and then obviously Trump goes on to win the presidential election. Close election, he loses the popular vote, but he wins the fucking election in an upset. He wins the swing states. He wins the Midwest, which was historically a Democrat-leaning area. He wins Wisconsin for the first time since Ronald Reagan, a Republican, had won. So, the neoconservatism, once again, is rejected. It's rejected. So people on the right, who are the true neocons, they have a decision to make. Not only has neoconservatism been rejected by the American public as a whole, it's been rejected by their own voters in Donald Trump. So they have a decision to make. Do we stay Republicans and try to continue to argue that neoconservatism is good? Do we try to basically try to make the word neoconservatism less toxic? Do we defend it? Or do we completely abandon it? That's another option. They come to Jesus moment and they realize that neoconservatism is bad. Or they do something in between, which is really sneaky, where they pretend they're no longer neoconservatism in rhetoric. Like they'll denounce neoconservatism, but they will always, at the end of the day, support neocon policies. But they'll try to wrap it in a more populist language, let's say. And that's what most of these people have done. That's what Ben Shapiro did. That's what Douglas Murray had done. That's why Mark Levin recently said that if you call someone a neocon, it's like a slur for Jew, like that's an anti-Semitic thing to do. Because he realizes how toxic the word neoconservatism is. That's why Douglas Murray, when Dave Smith brought up neoconservatism in their debate, Douglas Murray said, "Oh, the N-word, the N-word." What a gay faggot. Nothing wrong with gay people. I love gay people. Believe me, I love gay people. But, Douglas Murray sucks, so he gets to be called the F word every once. Hey, look, if the president can say retarded, I can say faggot. I think that's fair. Can we come to a compromise that the president can say, "You're a retard, you're stupid, retarded, Governor Tim Walz, you're retarded"? If the president can say that, I can say faggot, but I digress. But that's what they do. They decide we're not going to defend neoconservatism outright because it's so unpopular that people have rejected it. But at the end of the day, we're going to support neocon initiatives, but we're just not going to call it neoconservatism. We're going to try to use fluffy language to sort of mask it. Another example of this is Ted Cruz. Ted Cruz is being interviewed, that famous interview of Tucker Carlson when Tucker destroyed him. He tells Tucker that he's not a neocon. He also says he's not an isolationist, and he says there's this middle ground that he sort of operates in. And on the face of it, that's not unreasonable. You definitely don't want to be a neocon, but you don't necessarily want to be an isolationist. I can understand that. You don't always want to give up your right to use force or the option of using force. I understand that. I hate war, but I can understand that rationale. Again, I think the original Afghanistan war was justified because we were attacked and a lot of these people came from Afghanistan. I get it. It was defensive war in nature at the beginning. But Ted Cruz is being disingenuous because he really is a neocon. He almost always supports war. Just look at his stance on Ukraine, Russia. He was a total big funder. He was a big supporter of the funding of Ukraine. Okay, he still calls Russia like a big adversary for us for no real reason. He totally supported the bombing of Iran, even though Iran poses no real threat to us. And he was totally supportive of what was happening in Gaza, obviously, because he's a big Israel backer. I mean, here's an easy way of putting this. If you are a staunch Israel supporter, like a staunch one, not that you just sort of broadly support Israel's right to exist, which, that's sort of a weird concept. Does a country have a right to exist? I mean, I'm not even sure countries really have rights. Individuals have rights. I'm not even sure countries have rights. So it's sort of a weird thing to say, but you can support Israel's right, quote unquote, to exist. But does that mean that you have to support bombing Iran? No, but Ted Cruz did, because he's a neocon. He almost always supports neocon foreign policy. So that's what these people do now. They try to not to use the label neoconservatism because they know it's toxic, but they still support the neocon policies. Okay? So that's why you're seeing these people trying to now basically equate calling someone as a neocon as an anti-Semite, like people like Mark Levin are saying. Again, you can support neocon foreign policy if you want, but just be honest about it. Don't try to smear people as like anti-Semitic. Don't try to pretend you're not what you are like Ted Cruz did to Tucker Carlson. Just be honest, and then we can talk about it. Maybe you're right. Maybe neoconservatism just hasn't been done right. Maybe it's like communism. It's never fully been done right. Either way, maybe that's the case. I don't think so, but maybe. So, and this is sort of a warning to the Trump administration. Again, going back to the end of George W. Bush's presidency, you cannot be more focused on foreign policy than you are domestic policy and expect Republicans to do well in the midterms next year and the 2028 presidential election. It doesn't really matter how popular or unpopular the Democrats are, particularly in the midterms, because the midterms are usually just a referendum on how the country feels about the president, especially considering the fact that Republican voters are lower propensity voters. They are less likely in general to vote off your elections. That means next year is going to be really tough for Republicans unless shit changes fast and, Trump stops threatening to go into Venezuela and that other crap. I mean, Trump ran against neoconservatism foreign policy, and he's been more resistant than our previous presidents. I don't want to diminish that fact. He didn't start any new wars during his first administration. For the most part, he hasn't really started any new wars in his second one, although he got very close with Iran. I mean, that looked like for a half a second that we were going to do a full-on regime change war. I mean, Trump was even tweeting about that or truthing about it. Regime change maybe would be a good thing. Who wouldn't want regime change in Iran? It's like, that really scared the shit out of me. I was like, oh my God, dude, I've been defending you for like 10 years in high school and college, saying, oh no, Trump's really a peacemaker at heart, and now you're going around saying that we have to do... I was pretty stressed for a minute there. The whole last year for me has been stressful, not just because of that, but for many other things. But man, that didn't help my stress levels when he said that. But so far he's resisted, but it looks like we may be doing force in Venezuela, and if we do regime change in Venezuela, then Trump will have broken his promise not to start any new wars. And I really hope... He already arguably did that with the Iran strikes. I mean, we only bombed their nuclear facility and didn't kill anyone. So it ended up being more like him killing an Iranian general, Soleimani, during his first term, where it really could have started a larger conflict, but it didn't. I do think the Iran strikes were more similar to that than certainly the Iraq war, obviously. But if we do regime change in Venezuela, then no. Then yeah, Trump's promise not to start any new wars, not to be a neocon, will have been more or less broken. Hey, at least it wouldn't be a Middle Eastern country, though. I guess that'd be an improvement from the Bush people. Harder to blame Israel if you do regime change in Venezuela, right? So maybe the Israel First people will be less defensive about it. I don't know. So I wanted to do this rundown on neoconservatism because, again, I've been seeing people who used to be neocons who seemingly claim they're not, but clearly are based off the policies they continue to support. Even people like Mark Halperin. Mark Halperin will talk about how these forever wars, the regime change wars, are terrible. But then, he'll support us going into Iran. He'll support all these neocon initiatives being hawkish toward Russia. I'm not sure what he said about Venezuela, but, again, you see this in the establishment as a whole, trying to get away from the neocon label, but still supporting neocon initiatives. And it's problematic and needs to be called out, and that's why I wanted to do this podcast. And it's also a warning to the Trump administration Do not fall for the mistake that the Bush second term did, because, I do not want to see Trump's second term end the way Bush's second term ended, because that would not only be bad for the country, it would be really bad for the Republican Party, and certainly J.D. Vance. Anyway, folks, that's it for today. Again, sorry for the wacky schedule, but Thanksgiving, other stuff came up, but we should be back on schedule going forward. Again, please subscribe, whether it's on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever the hell you listen to this podcast. I would really appreciate it. I'm working on a little documentary. It should be out maybe next month or next 2 months, not exactly sure, but I think you'll enjoy it. We'll see you tomorrow, folks. Bye-bye.